And it gives me pleasure to open the meeting in our traditional way by ringing. Now, for this meeting, I'm going to start in a slightly different way. I'm going to call on our almoner, Harry, if he would care to give his report at the beginning of the meeting.
Right. Fellow Rotarians, I hope you can hear me. I think everyone is aware of the very sad news of the loss of our honorary member, His Royal Highness, Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh. A very sad day. And after I finish my report, I'm going to hand this back to President, who is going to make an announcement. I also need to sadly tell you that Shuet Desengani, who's I think our number 1 and number 2 member, his wife Suda has passed away. So it is regret that I have to tell you that as well. Over to you, President David.
I must admit, Harry, I was expecting to give an announcement about a silence, but
yeah,
I will now
I was
ask
going to
all.
leave that to you.
No. Okay, thank you. I'll ask, if I may, all members to respect our passing member with 2 minutes silence. Perhaps a minute to reflect on his services to the nation and a minute to reflect on what he means to us personally. But I'm hoping that we have in attendance on this call members representing district and Rotary in Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So if you would, when I stop speaking, respect a 2 minute silence. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed for maintaining your silence. I'll call the meeting back to order. I'd like to inquire whether we have District Governor Francis on the call.
President David, we have RIBI President Tom Griffin and District Governor Francis, who are both on the call.
Thank you. I wonder if either of them would like to say a word to the club, perhaps their own reflection on the passing of the Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh. Tom, would you start perhaps?
Thank you, President. Yes, thank you for the opportunity. Yes, I think it's His Royal Highness Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, has been part of our, well, for somebody like me, been part of our lives for all our lives, and a very significant figure in our society, in our community, and of course in Rotary. Honorary member of this club, honorary member in Windsor and in Edinburgh, and I believe in Hunstanton in my own district. And I know that he maintained good contact and involvement with your club, and he respected what Rotary does and what Rotary achieves. And I think it is appropriate today that we should mark with sadness and respect his passing and recognise all that he has done for our country. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much indeed, President Tom. District Governor Francis, would you like to add from the district's point of view, perhaps?
Thank you very much, President David. I want to echo what Tom has already said. His Royal Highness is somebody who, before I even came to England, I'd heard about, and it was very sad on Friday for me to learn of his passing. Of course, I have paid tribute to him on behalf of the district, and indeed all other people who found him to be a complete personification of selfless service. And therefore, on behalf of the district, I really want to say my condolences here and to thank you, the Rotary Club of London, for organizing this special tribute. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you very much indeed, District Governor Francis. The contribution that the Prince has made to Rotary has probably yet to be fully recorded. I know that he spoke with us in 1950, representing the Playing Fields Association, and later Duke of Edinburgh Award Scheme and other things. I know that he was first became a member of formerly a member of Rotary in 1952 with the Edinburgh Club, and I think he became a member of the Windsor Club in 1954. A club that he used to pop into unannounced on a Monday from time to time. And so we have a history of an association, and I would like to ask both the district and particularly the members of my club if they would help us this year to recognise our association with Prince Philip when he is no longer here to receive a cheque from our hands, by making contributions to the Duke of Edinburgh's Award Scheme charity. And we have modernised ourselves. We have a donor box link at the top of chat box for anybody who feels inclined to make a donation to the club for that purpose now. And I'm hoping that we can work with Rotary International, with Rotary Great Britain and Ireland, and with the district to actually achieve something in the absence of Prince Philip that he would have been so pleased if he could actually have attended personally to supervise. So thank you, all of you, for maintaining the silence and for joining us in this commemoration of a great life, well lived, of service. Thank you. At our next meeting, next week's meeting at the AGM, we will be putting together a fuller obituary for members. But I have asked the President and the District Governor to attend for this part of the meeting. And I know that there are others who would like to perhaps depart shortly. But before I do that, if I may, I will call on Eric Rainey from Belfast to give us a few words about his personal knowledge of the Duke of Edinburgh's Award Scheme. For 20 years, he ran the scheme in Northern Ireland, and he is a Deputy Lieutenant of the area. Eric, are you available to speak to us?
Eric has to unmute.
Thank you. That should be clear. Mr. President, thank you for the unexpected opportunity to say a word or two, and it's a very great pleasure to do so. The Duke of Edinburgh's award, and therefore the Duke of Edinburgh himself, had been very much part of my life for all of my working life, when initially I introduced his award in a small secondary school in County Tyrone, where I had started as a teacher, and then laterally as an operating authority responsibility within our local education authority. But for the last 30, or at least for the 30 years prior to my retirement, I was privileged then to be the director of the award in Northern Ireland. And we were always particularly proud of the fact that although we had a small population, we had a much greater than average penetration into that population of participation. And without spelling anything out in unnecessary terms, that was right across the total community in Northern Ireland and in all of those other areas that dealt with young people, most at risk, as well as within schools and youth organisations. So it's a privilege to pay tribute to the patron, but Lady Mary Peters, who is a member of our club in Belfast, telephoned the other day and said, Eric, I realise that you have lost a friend. And I thought I had never actually thought of the relationship in that terms. And then I looked back at some of the correspondence that Prince Philip wrote to his various directors, and he always wrote them personally in his own hand, signed in his own hand. And I realized that here was a man who, in that small way, and in so many other organizations, had a deeply personal and hands-on feeling for all that he did. He would have turned up, even up to some years ago when he was still driving, in award headquarters in Windsor, unannounced, just literally to see what was happening. So it's a very real privilege to join you today. Thank you for the opportunity to speak, which I do with a very great degree of pleasure. And thank you again for the invitation to those of us from this part of the world to join you today. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much indeed, Eric. I really appreciate your contribution. And now it is about 1 o'clock, and I know that your meeting starts about now. So I will formally end the commemorative session, and we will move on to our normal meeting. Thank you, everybody who's attended for this part of our meeting, which we hope will actually bring us together and take us forward, and not mark the end of anything. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President David. I want to add to that to say that I've totally enjoyed the opportunity, and I'm hoping other clubs, even though they are not hosts or formerly hosts of His Royal Highness, would follow in your footsteps and recognize the very sterling job he did being the consorts to the Queen. Thank you very much. I have to leave now. Thank you.
And thank you, President, for the invitation and the opportunity to be with you, however briefly, this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, President David, on behalf of Belfast, and we'll leave you and return to our meeting now. So thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us. Right, on with our meeting. I would like the next item is the cheerful one of birthdays, and I hope we have at least one birthday boy on this call. I'd like to wish happy birthday to Anthony Newton. I don't know whether Anthony, you must be there somewhere.
Yeah, Anthony's on the call.
Are you going to admit to being another year older on the 16th, Anthony?
He's muted at the moment, but he's still here.
I couldn't see Alfred Magnus, though.
A decade younger.
A year younger.
A decade younger, yeah.
Anyway, happy birthday, Anthony, and to thank you for being the great supporter you are of all that this Rotary Club does. I also like to remind people that there is a district council meeting on the 15th of April, and we can have 5 voters there, but any member can attend the district council. HECO has been coordinating support, and so if anybody is going to be at the district council meeting on the 15th, please let HECO know. I'd now like to ask Chicago, or perhaps Ian Balcombe, to let us know how the AGM is developing. Do you have any an update on the process of election and of the AGM, Chicago?
Hello, hi. Thank you, President David. Hopefully, everybody received the ballot by post. It's by Friday is a deadline, so everybody try to make it to return the ballot paper to the address already written on the envelope. And then we have two the participant the helping for the ballot to open at the vice president the Ian's the resident. So we will proceed the process. Thank you.
Vice President Ian, do you have have you had 110 ballots back so far, or are you still waiting for 1 or 2?
Still waiting for 1 or 2. Now they're coming in steadily, but still waiting for quite a few actually. So if you haven't voted, please make sure that you do so. Certainly, but well, by Friday morning, yeah, Friday post.
Thank you. This is the opportunity for members to shape the future of the club, and please take it and cast your votes. Right, moving on. I'd like to ask you to raise your glass, and on this particular occasion, and perhaps it's a little bit somber in tone, to toast the Queen and the royal family at this time of great difficulty for them in adjusting to their loss. So the Queen.
The Queen.
The Queen.
I now call on our past president, Varsi Daniels, to introduce our speaker. Varsi.
Thank you. President David, distinguished guests, and fellow Rotarians, it does give me great pleasure and delight to welcome a very familiar face, Emeritus Professor Kevin Clements, to our Rotary Club of London. Most of you would remember him. He's a familiar face. He spoke last year at our International Day of Peace. And he is also a former member of our Rotary Club of London several years ago. Professor Kevin is the director of the Toda Peace Institute and former foundation chair of Peace and Conflict of the New Zealand Centre of Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Otago, Dunedin, New Zealand. His career has been a combination of academic analysis and practice in the areas of peace buildings and conflict transformation. Kevin was formerly director of the Quaker United Nations office in Geneva and head of the Peace Research Centre at the Australian National University in Canberra. And prior to that, he was senior lecturer in sociology and coordinator of peace studies at the Canterbury University, Christchurch, New Zealand. And he was lecturer in sociology at Hong Kong University and doctoral fellowship at Oxford. Professor Kevin has been a regular consultant to a variety of non-governmental and intergovernmental organizations on disarmament, arms control, conflict resolution development, and regional issues. He has written several books, and here are some of them: Kevin P. Clements and the Psycho Aikida 2019, Toward a Century of Peace, a dialogue on the role of civil society in peace building. and Kevin P. Clements, Identity, Trust, and Reconciliation in East Asia, dealing with painful history to create a peaceful present. And finally, Kevin P. Clements and Sung Young Lee, edition 2020. President David, fellow Rotarians, our speaker, Professor Kevin Clements. Thank you.
President David, I have not seen Professor Clements and I cannot see him on the list of participants.
Oh dear, it's midnight. It's, I can give him a call.
Please do, Vasi. We should know whether he is able to attend or not.
I'll go to the other room.
While we're waiting for Vasi to check the connection with Professor Clements, and there may be any number of reasons why he's not with us. I have been asking members of the club for anecdotes of their meetings with Prince Philip, formally and informally. And I wondered whether there was anybody on the call who, following on from the reflection from Belfast, would like to make any comment.
Yeah, he's just coming now.
Oh, okay, he's coming now.
Yeah, he's just coming.
Thank you. Thanks, Vasi.
That's okay.
Big sigh of relief.
Well, it's midnight. It's midnight there.
I know, above and beyond the call of duty, but he volunteered, remember? Did he volunteer or did you ask him?
You talking to me? No. Sorry.
Yeah, well, I was asking you whether he was a volunteer or whether he was one of your requests.
No, I asked.
You can be very persuasive. You can be very persuasive. Yeah.
Well, he was very happy to talk to us because he only had 10 minutes 12 minutes last year when we had the international panel. And I promised him I'll invite him again. So you see, hope he's got the link now.
Well, there's no need to repeat what you said. He knows all that you told us about him. He doesn't need to be informed. So
he's joining now. Well, he was joining, but he hasn't appeared. Oh, yes, he's muted. He needs to unmute himself. He's with us. Professor Clements, can you unmute yourself, please? And then you will appear.
Can you hear me all right?
We can now. Yes, thank you very much.
Seeing you now. Yeah.
Sorry about the, I was just saying that I thought I was coming on at 12:30. But what's the time in London right now?
11 minutes past 1.
Oh goodness! I'm sorry. I thought we were exactly 12 hours difference because we.
It's our fault. We've done the funny thing and gone on to British summertime. So we should have notified you that we've gone peculiar. We've moved our clocks. I understand the problem.
You're now 1 o'clock instead of 12.
Yeah.
Oh golly, I'm sorry about this. Anyway, well, thank you for.
No, You have been introduced by Varsity very well and very extensively, and we're all looking forward to your talk. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much. Well, before I began, I just sort of wanted to offer commiserations on the loss of your life member, the Duke of Edinburgh. And
thank you.
Thank you. It's sort of sad for all of us. In fact, it's kind of appropriate, I think, in terms of the talk that I'm giving, is that we're sort of having this conversation 3 days after Prince Philip died. I mean, at the age of 99, he lived through what Eric Hobsbawm called the age of extremes. The Great Depression, the rise of fascism and communism, the Second World War, the Holocaust, the development of weapons of mass destruction, the end of European empires, and the flowering of the post-Second World War liberal world order. And I think he and the Queen over the years have endeavored to maintain some sort of semblance of continuity and political stability in the face of all of those extreme challenges. And his death and I guess the eventual death of the Queen herself, I mean, in a way, both painfully symbolize what I call the end of 20th century certainty. We've now got to grapple with political, social, economic, and religious turbulence of a kind that we've never seen before. Here I'm sure, I'm not sure if I'm got all of the demographics right, but we post-war babies, I count myself as a post-war baby, are direct beneficiaries of that old liberal world order. And for us, it generated extraordinary affluence, high levels of education, and extraordinary technological change. But it also created high levels of inequality and some tectonic forces that we're just beginning to understand. My old colleague, Ken Boulding, thought that the 21st century would be an age of maturity when people would realize the centrality of negotiated solutions to problems and the importance of cooperative problem solving. In fact, however, far from being an age of maturity, this century is rapidly becoming an age of tumult and radical transformation. I can't recall a moment in my life when the order that we've grown up with seems to be crumbling so dramatically in the face of global challenges. So what I want to talk about there are sort of 2 or 3 different things and then move on to some solutions and throw it open to questions. The first is that I think we're experiencing what we might call globalized insecurity. I think globalization has generated both positive and negative dynamics. And the negative ones, I think, are now feeding and amplifying a deep sense of generalized insecurity that far exceeds the problem-solving capabilities of existing national, regional, and global institutions. And these insecurities flow from the things which you're all very familiar with: climate change, ecological crises, financial and humanitarian catastrophes, epidemics and pandemics, wars, genocides, and displaced populations. And they're responsible for generating high and rising levels of individual and collective global anxiety. I don't know what it's like in the UK, but here, for example, there have been an extraordinary upsurge of numbers of young people experiencing quite deep depressions and anxiety about the future. I mean, so it's having a very real impact on people's individual lives. And these things are fueling, our old familiars of right-wing populism and xenophobia and unpeacefulness. In the 2021 Global Peace Index, which I've been involved with, 83 countries improved their peacefulness over the past year, but 73 countries have become more unpeaceful. So I think this deepening anxiety, both at the individual level, at the national level, and at the global level, I think is something that is kind of characteristic of our time. I mean, it's been precipitated to a large extent by the global pandemic, which has really problematized the whole question of normality. But it's also beginning to highlight the interconnected nature of all of the different threats. And these have been amplified as well by modern communications, which really annihilated space through time, except when I get the daylight saving times wrong. And that means that no one can remain unaware of what's happening anywhere in the world. And the world's people in the century are deeply aware of the sort of scale and interconnectedness of all the diverse threats to human security and well-being. You know, this our generation is now as much as we have as much information at our disposal through our devices as most political leaders, even with the assistance of their intelligence agencies. So I think this awareness and the anxiety that goes with it is really troubling. But what makes it even more troubling is parallel recognition of the incapacity and in many instances paralysis of existing social, political and legal institutions to govern effectively, which is why I've called this talk Governance in an Age of Extraordinary Transition. In particular, nation states seem to have a complete inability to ethically regulate the unprecedented volume, speed and intensity of cross-border flows which are driving negative globalization, such as, you know, corrupt money, arms, drugs, pathogens, greenhouse gases, displaced peoples, human trafficking, violence, negative images, and fake information, to just name a few. And these flows are highly injurious to the environment, human dignity, health, education, social equity, cultural literacy, and the democratic ethic itself. So I think we're facing a kind of a truly global storm of problems which are proving not only just wicked in terms of the traditional understanding of wicked problems, but they are also proving to be quite intractable. So the sort of second point I want to make has to do with sort of governance in the 21st century. These negative consequences, I think, are both a cause and a consequence of what I call governance deficits. National institutions are struggling in advanced industrial states as much as in failed states. Who would have thought, for example, that the two of the most powerful countries in the world, the UK and the US, have been so incapable of early and effective responses to the COVID crisis. And I think that all around the world we're becoming more and more aware that parliaments, governments and political parties are being buffeted by volatile transnational markets, by global catastrophes like pandemics, by poorly planned technical innovation, and deepening polarization within and between different societies. They lack most governments these days lack the competence, resources and legitimacy and the will to manage complex transnational exchanges. So this, I think, is a kind of is a particular challenge facing us in the middle of the 21st century, and it's also exacerbated by the fact that as long as people benefit from a disordered global community, there'll be little incentive to write effective global legislation against negative globalization. Russian oligarchs, for example, have helped generate disorder in a number of different countries so they can engage in nefarious criminal activity with impunity. Western accountants at shell companies, lawyers, lobbyists, bankers, and real estate developers, for example, have also helped kleptocrats and crooked officials launder wealth pillaged from their home countries. I mean, the release of the Panama Papers in 2016, which was a leak of over 11 million documents from one of the world's largest providers of offshore companies, offered a particularly vivid picture of the liberal economic order's dark side and the kinds of negative dynamics that are challenging democracy, challenging the rule of law and global order. And in the context of this, we're kind of faced with a major deficit in political leadership and the growing irrelevance of a lot of political leaders' decision-making. And as a consequence, many political leaders are resorting to short-term fixes, political spin, populism, fear-based politics, and sort of a 19th and 20th century patriotism which is singularly unhelpful in dealing with 21st century problems. In 2021, for example, for the first time since the end of the Cold War, Freedom House now says that nearly 75% of the world's populations live in countries with deteriorating human rights and appalling democratic records. China and Russia have been arguing that democracies are inferior to their own regimes, and they feel they can do this by strengthening their international influence, by coercive diplomacy, and hoping that they can escape accountability. In any event, all of this means that the old 19th and 20th century state-centric paradigms, which in a sense have governed our own lifetimes, and which authorize the state to deliver public goods and protection against threats, are losing traction. Those states continue to jealously guard their sovereignty. In practice, sovereignty is steadily eroding as state orders become increasingly porous and as problems become transnationalized. More and more individuals, I think, understand this, and they're becoming emboldened to critique and attack state systems and institutions, and with the consequence they become weaker and incapable of effective problem solving. Trump was probably the worst example of a democratically elected incompetent leader, subverting US political institutions, undermining the American rule of law, and finally encouraging his supporters to attack Congress itself. So I think that we're confronted with a perfect storm of problems which have transnational scope and significance and which require transnational solutions. We have governance systems which are incapable of dealing with them. And we're discovering as well that the institutions which were devised at the end of the Second World War to combat the limitations of the state-centric paradigm, institutions such as the UN and the EU, are now themselves are under attack and threatened. Even though the UN, for example, remains critical to global well-being, multilateralism as an idea is under significant threat as leaders in nation states try and assert a national capacity and a national willingness to solve global problems, which they can't do unless there are effective global institutions to debate in and dialogue about appropriate responses. The inability of the World Health Organization, for example, to devise a coherent and effective global response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and the failure of UN-sponsored international conferences to bring about urgently needed reduction of carbon emissions are sort of glaring examples of this. So you also have a situation in the 21st century where powerful states and corporate interests, often working in tandem, have actively resisted effective cross-border regulatory institutions and processes. So all of this means that in the face of global insecurity and anxiety, our national and our international institutions are proving highly incapable of responding effectively to imminent and long-term threats to social, political, and economic well-being. So the third point is that we're also living in a multi-centric world. The liberal world order, which followed the Second World War, was based on the hegemony of the West, led by the US, the UK, and their allies. But US and Western global ascendancy can no longer be taken for granted. And a multi-centric world is rapidly developing in which major areas of wealth, centers of wealth, and diplomatic clout are shifting from the West to China, Northeast Asia, and India. And these new economic and political centers are accompanied by the promotion of Chinese, Indian, and Islamic cultures. So in addition to all of these problems and the kinds of problems associated with big power transitions, we have what I think can be thought of as inter-civilizational shifts as well, which I think fuel some of the sort of xenophobia and nationalism which we see in many countries around the world at the moment. While these new cultures, I mean, well, they're really old cultures, I mean, like China and Japan and India and so forth, are not going to replace Western Enlightenment values in the short term. They have the capacity for destabilizing confidence in those values, and they have a capacity for replacing them in the medium to long term as the big power transitions sort themselves out. This means that we in the West have got to become accustomed to different ways of seeing the world, different cultural ways of seeing the world, and different conceptions of governance. Even when the trappings of Western liberal democracy have been adopted in countries such as Japan or Singapore, for example, political cultures and practice often conform to a very different set of more culturally explicit hierarchical autocratic norms. In any event, this sort of new multi-centricity and the intercivilizational shifts are generating their own kind of anxiety as Western values and beliefs rub up against totally different traditions. And we're left wondering whether our values have the same currency now as they used to have in the heyday of the post-Second World War liberal order. So where do we go to from here? If my argument's right, and a growing governance deficit is responsible for challenges to the democratic project and an inability to control the dynamics driving negative globalization, then it's really critical that individual states, regional global organizations start focusing more attention on their own governmental capacities, effectiveness, and legitimacy. I think that many of our government institutions in the most advanced Western societies, for example, are proving incapable for responding effectively to the challenges that they're confronting. The global pandemic, for example, demonstrates what happens when there are ineffective national, regional, and global mechanisms for mitigating and eliminating the virus. And I think this pandemic is and should be a wake-up call to look at how relevant national, regional, global health institutions might learn from what's happening to ensure more joined up and effective responses to future pandemics. So this I sort of take as, it's a crisis, but it's also an opportunity to think in a much more kind of creative way about how at the global level we can develop what we might call a sort of a global whole of governance approach, which combines a whole range of different sovereignties at the local, provincial, national, regional, and global levels, so that we can engage in trying to gather as much collective wisdom as possible from as many different levels as possible about how to do new kinds of analyses, new sorts of diagnostics, and come up with different kinds of prescriptions for the crises that we're confronting. I mean, I know there are going to be all sorts of obstacles to such global governance, just as there is to the whole notion of joined up governance at the national level. But I think, at a national level, joined up governments has proven effective, and I think it could prove equally effective at the transnational level in terms of some institutional response, developing new effective institutions to responding to the global threats that are afflicting us. Secondly, it's becoming clear that the renewal of the democratic project, which I firmly believe in, rests on the intentional development of resilient and adaptable communities and societies. I'm firmly persuaded that political systems of the kind that we have at the moment are not going to be able to solve their own problems and become more capable and effective acting alone. There's a lot of intellectual firepower and creativity out there in civil society that needs to be harnessed, liberated, and then harnessed in order to kind of create different kinds of relationships between the state and civil society. And I want to sort of argue that the strength of national polities is really directly connected to the strength, suppleness, and adaptability of communities and the individuals who constitute them. So at the national level, therefore, I think there needs to be a lot more focused attention on identifying community resources that will generate economic, social, political protection and collaboration, and more importantly, focus a range of different perspectives on the problems which are facing us at national, regional, and global levels. If this requires the development of a new 21st century contract between state and society and new concepts of citizenship, then so be it. I think the critical point is that locals are by and large more familiar with ways of safeguarding and protecting their own communities than strangers or remote central government actors. So focusing on community and social well-being will require more attention being paid to institutions not normally associated with governance, like Parliament, the executive, the judiciary. In other words, we need to kind of focus more attention on the resources that exist within educational institutions, research centers, institutes and think tanks, NGOs, civil society organizations, which are working on issues of environment, development, human rights, to some racial equality, and other public goods. We've got to liberate kind of creativity from the bottom up if we're going to kind of help policies become more effective, capable, and legitimate. Other relevant constituencies which have to be brought into these sorts of conversations include the legal, health, information, and community sectors, as well as ethnic and religious communities. You know, the March 6th massacre here in Christchurch, New Zealand, for example, has generated much, much higher levels of governmental sensitivity to religious pluralism and interfaith relationships than ever existed before. And it's having all kinds of interesting repercussions. It's changed who our security intelligence services are looking at, for example. And it's making everybody more sensitive to ways in which we can build in tolerance at all levels of sort of human activity, at the community level, at the society level, and at the national levels. So I think that just as with the UE, each national government should practice a principle of subsidiarity. I mean, looking for effective decision-making at the lowest possible levels. And I think that revitalized communities and harnessing the creativity of all of the different institutions I've been talking about above will make a more consultative contract between state and citizen possible, and will make the task of government easier. Thirdly, given the interconnected and interdependent nature of the world, it's really crucial that revitalized societies and polities devote more organizational and financial resources to regional and multilateral institutions. If it were possible to reverse Brexit, that would be a very good start for those of us interested in this project. If that seems utopian, it's nevertheless critical that all states diligently comply with all the obligations under international treaties, conventions, and covenants. We sort of forget what, what international law sort of exists in nascent form, which can be activated to begin grappling with some of these sort of terribly negative exchanges that are a consequence of negative globalization. If there's to be an international rule of law, and if there's to be international peace under the rule of law, then state parties have got to develop mechanisms that have got some teeth and capacity to deal with all the transnational exchanges that currently subvert national sovereignty and well-being. If this means, this may simply mean dusting off current agreements and seeing how much they're compliance with their central tenets. For example, the Non-Proliferation Treaty governing the use and possession of nuclear weapons, provides an extraordinarily good treaty for asking whether the British government's current decision to develop and expand its nuclear arsenal is acceptable under international law. And I think looking at Section 6 of that treaty it's clear that probably isn't. But I think that if nation states and international organizations themselves can begin a kind of a revitalizing of the agreements that have come into play, and if future agreements can have more teeth and better implementation kind of capacities, that's going to be very positive. The doctrine of responsibility to protect, for example, while it doesn't have any automatic link to coercive humanitarian intervention, it does focus attention on the state's protection of its citizens and could and should be activated in relation to the current crisis in Myanmar. So we've got a lot of different mechanisms in place which can and should be activated in relation to some of the kind of most egregious examples of inhumanity that are kind of confronting us in the 21st century. To do this effectively, however, in relation to R2P, requires state willingness and UN compliance with its provisions, and a Security Council that's not supine to P5 machinations, and in this particular instance, the machinations of Russia and China. And finally, whether one likes it or not, I mean, coherent transnational responses to climate change, pandemics, and other threats to human security now have to be devised in the context of cultural, religious, and civilizational plurality. What makes this task even more demanding is the fact that this plurality now functions in a different setting from which prevailed when the West was unquestionably ascendant. Western norms, laws, and institutions are now being questioned with rising confidence, not just by China, but by many others that previously experienced colonial rule and were the all the kind of countries that emerged from, the heyday of European imperialism. One thing is clear: reforming and transforming the norms, laws, and institutions of governance can't happen overnight, but we've got to start somewhere. For example, those of us who are interested in human rights have to weigh up economic dependence versus the promotion of what used to be thought of as global human rights values. We've had a very interesting example of this recently in relation to New Zealand and Australian perspectives on how to challenge China over its treatment of Uyghurs and its handling of democratic movements in Hong Kong. The Australian government took a very hard line with China, and China responded with an equally hard line in terms of essentially boycotting, providing major tariffs against a large number of key Australian exports to China. New Zealand, on the other hand, had a more muted approach, which some of us felt was too muted, and the Chinese government has been very careful not to kind of focus with Australia in relation to their megaphonic assertion of human rights values. I'm just sort of using that as an illustration of sort of some of the challenges facing countries like Australia and New Zealand, which are heavily dependent on trade with China, in relation to an assertion of universalistic Western values and human rights principles, which might threaten kind of trade links and security. So we now face a whole range of existential threats, which I've been talking about, like climate change, nuclear weapons, pandemics, which require urgent solutions. But we've really got to begin thinking about how do we sequence responses to them? What are appropriate short-term and long-term strategies? What are the initiatives that are appropriate for each timescale? Who are the potential agents of change? The West can no longer think of itself as the primary agent of change in relation to these kinds of transformations that I've been talking about. How do we kind of liberate more wisdom, skill, resource, and organizational capacity for this task of transformation in this age of extraordinary uncertainty? I mean, one thing is sure, this is a moment when the kind of, the tectonic plates of social, economic, and political life are in motion, and all of our post-Second World War arrangements are finding themselves increasingly shaky. So there's no doubt in my mind that the pursuit of effective non-autocratic governance, respect for human rights, and diminished reliance on militarism, military solution, and the promotion of values that we can all agree on is the issue for the 21st century. The social, economic, and political tectonic plates are shifting beneath our feet, however, meaning we don't have much time to waste. We're operating on shaky foundation. If this age of extraordinary uncertainty has become an age of collective well-being and good governance, we've got to reorder domestic, regional, and global priorities so that human security, human welfare, and the common good, rather than state security and state interests, are at the heart of our endeavors. Thanks very much. I'm sorry I was late.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Well, you weren't very late starting, actually. Thank you very much indeed, Professor Kevin. Now, I'm sure we have questions from our audience, and I'll ask Clive Amos to control our questioners in a moment. But I'd just like to thank you for the extraordinary range of your presentation. We've had various presentations recently that impinge on your views, and in all of what you're talking about, I'm always looking for hope. And I'm hoping that the questioners will actually find something that you can respond to very positively. Clive, over to you.
Thank you very much, President David. Can I just remind you, please, and some people have already done it, and I thank them, if you wish to ask a question, if you unmute yourself, it brings you to the top of my list, which I can see on my screen, or you can raise your hand. And I see 2 hands are already raised, and I'm going to start with Past President Anthony Newton and then Mahmoud Ahmed. Anthony Newton, your question, please.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for an extremely interesting talk. You mentioned New Zealand a few times. The image the rest of the world have about New Zealand is, of course, of a remarkably successful and stable society. So internally, I wonder to what extent you regard that as an exception to your general thesis. And my second question also is to ask you whether, in the efforts to achieve more international certainty, would you encourage and beef up international mediation and arbitration, and so in what way? Thank you.
Great. Well, in a way, New Zealand is a bit of an exception. I mean, we're here at the on the other side of the world, and with the largest moat of any country, and we have managed to kind of basically eliminate COVID, and the government. But what's interesting about that, in a sense, in terms of what I was talking about, in terms of the kind of the centrality of community, is that Jacinda Ardern's appeal there was to kind of to see ourselves as a team fighting the virus, and she was heavily dependent on social and community compliance with state authority, and indeed got away with requests which were even more extreme in a way than those that normally prevail in wartime. And I think that says something about the kind of the nature of state-society relationship. But New Zealand is highly privileged and relatively affluent, and we've done well in relation to the crisis. But we have a whole series of problems which are in sort of a sense global in scope. We have a major housing crisis with young people unable to afford housing anymore. We have deep and growing sense of racial inequality, which we've got to grapple with, which echo with a lot of the deep divisions that are occurring elsewhere in the world. From having been a highly egalitarian society with a low Pareto coefficient, we're now one of, we've got high and growing levels of inequality. So a lot of the things that I've been talking about, are being grappled with by this government, but like most Western governments at the moment, the problems themselves are challenging, and we're not making as much progress on them as we might. Sure. In relation to international mediation and bolstering the United Nations and so forth, I heartily agree. I mean, Secretary General Guterres has been trying to kind of, make a push for COVID, providing an opportunity for putting an end to sort of some of the major conflicts that exist around the world. But there's absolutely no doubt at all that we need more regional mechanisms like the OSCE, conflict prevention mechanism, global mechanisms of elders and others that can, really begin moving into places, like Mozambique or Ethiopia and other places which are kind of, or the Ukraine again. I mean, so that we could engage in proactive and preemptive conflict resolution and conflict transformation under the auspices of appropriate UN or regional institutions. So that's definitely a kind of a part of this. And what we've seen is that when these institutions have been established, the ASEAN Regional Forum is one example of this, or the ASEAN ministerial meetings, for example, in Southeast Asia. They don't happen to be able to solve the Myanmar crisis, but they have kept a lot of other discontents as basically tractable discontents rather than allowing them to move into polarized divisions and confrontations.
Are you an optimist or pessimist, Kevin?
I'm an optimist. I'm an optimist, but we're confronted. We're being confronted with some God Almighty challenges, and I think it's finally poised. When you look at what's happening, if you look at recent elections in many democracies recently, there's a deep polarization which makes it almost difficult and challenging for any government to govern effectively, because they're only governing for one half of the population. I mean, the recent American population is, basically down the middle, with 73 million people feeling disgruntled.
Thank you. Mahmoud Ahmed, your question, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor. I'm very glad to hear you're an optimist. And also, thank you very much for coming on at such an awkward time for you. In your presentation, which I found very interesting indeed, you mentioned about the role of civil society as a possible force for good in trying to bring things around on the question of governance. The thing that I just wanted to ask you was that the education systems that we have in most countries, I'm not aware, maybe you are, to what extent there is emphasis on teaching of the values, which are the bedrock, of civil society organizations like the Rotary Club, for example. Values of integrity, honesty, good faith, putting the collective good above individual success or progress. These are values which are universal values. They're not unique to one faith or another faith. But I don't see myself any sort of national debate or any attempt to cultivate a better and deeper understanding amongst young people as they grow up. It's kind of left to parents to deal with. It's left to faith groups to deal with. There doesn't seem to be enough emphasis on that. And it just seems to me that part of what we're facing now is the consequence of many, many years of neglect. I may be wrong, but that's just a thought I had when I heard you talk about the role of civil society. And I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts about that. Thank you.
That's an excellent question, Mahmoud. And I think that's one of the challenges that we're facing. One of the consequences of the sort of intercivilizational shift as well is that, the world, we can't assume any longer that Western values are going to reign supreme. I mean, there's been a very systematic and careful rejection of Western values by China, both in relation to the principle of non-interference, but also in terms of its rejection of the universalization of what they consider to be Western human rights values. And so we're living in a world of contested values. And I think this is also generating lots of stresses and strains, uncertainties and anxieties in many of our Western democracies. So that religious institutions, for example, are no longer able to play that integrative role that they used to play, because, by and large, most of Western societies are now highly secularized. And what passes for religious values in places like the US, for example, are heavily fundamentalist, extremist, evangelical values, which, give rise to intolerance, prejudice, and bias. And so I think that you're absolutely right. I think there's a real need for us to begin thinking about what is our vision of a kind of a globalized world. What's our vision for national polities? What are the values which have stood the test of time, like, you know, the golden rule value about doing unto others and have them do unto you? I mean, that in itself as a value is sort of is moot very often now. The principles of reciprocity, kind of making sure that, you know, that you do things for others and the expectation that they'll do good things for you. I mean, all of these values are really at a premium. And I think that there's a real need for us to begin thinking about how do we incorporate these things into educational socialization rather than leaving it up to families to provide, you know, the value framework for an individual as they set off into a future of high turbulence at the moment. And so that's a really important question. And it involves some sensitivity to others' values. What does it mean to open up a conversation or a dialogue between China and the West about values which may guarantee a good life and the common good for everybody, and which may also reinforce things like integrity and honesty and truthfulness?
Thank you. Margaret Cooper.
Oh.
Margaret, your question.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much, Clive. Professor, what a comprehensive talk you gave on your subject. And my question is, would you say democracy has had its day? With the rise of the far right and even the election of Joe Biden, I think the West is very happy and they think the status quo is going to come back after Trump. Would you say democracy really has had its day when autocratic governments all over the world are on the right and just getting their way and subduing their citizens? So what do you say about that? Do you think democracy has had its day?
Well,
in view of all the talk, in view of all I've heard from you.
Yes, thanks, Margaret, for your question. You hear me? Professor. Yes, we've heard your question, thanks. Do you think democracy's had its day? Professor Clements.
Well, I hope not, but it's under enormous threat. I can't recall a moment in my lifetime when democratic institutions and the rule of law have been so systematically challenged in Hungary and in Poland, in America, in Japan, and all sorts of different places. Democratic institutions have been deeply challenged. In Myanmar is a recent example. You know, of a military coup following what to all intents and purposes was a perfectly reasonable and acceptable election. So I think the democratic project is under threat. And if you look at Freedom House right now, they see more deterioration in human rights and democracy than improvements. And this, I think, is cause for deep concern. And that's why I think there's a real need to think about how this might be revitalized. And the only way I think it can be revitalized is by a kind of a more intentional decentralization of democracy to community levels, to societal levels, and so forth, so that there's a greater real willingness to engage in real dialogue, real conversation, and real consultations, not just at a top-down level, but the creation of different kinds of venues and arrangements for harnessing the wisdom of everybody, rather than just the wisdom of the elites. And I think you know, a lot of the challenges to democracy flow from a real discontent with elite leadership, elite academics, elite media, and so forth. You know, people like me are not considered to be. You know, our views are you know, should have no more currency to some extent than the views of a person that's not normally invited to speak to the London Rotary Club. And so how do we become more sensitive to the voices, the voicelessness of large numbers of people who feel marginalized and alienated and even humiliated by democratic institutions?
Thank you. Well, unfortunately, President David, we don't have any more time for questions, and I wonder if I could hand back to you for you to invite a vote of thanks to be proposed. President David.
Yeah, so thank you very much indeed, Past President Clive. I call on Anthony Newton to give the vote of thanks on behalf of the club. Anthony.
Thank you very much indeed. What a pleasure and a privilege to listen to such a serious, intense and comprehensive talk, Kevin. Thank you very much for that. Kevin, as you'll have read from the CV, is a very, very distinguished person who has contributed already enormously to world peace and understanding. It's interesting that his talk more than matched his remarkable CV. He's spoken with huge interest, covering, as I said, a wide range of subjects, interestingly, stimulatingly, and dealt accordingly with questions and answers. Long may you continue, Kevin, to contribute as you have been doing to the international cause of furthering peace and understanding. And long may you continue also to add luster to the names of famous New Zealanders who have contributed so much to the world of peace and understanding, like Jacinda herself, Hillary, and all sorts of famous people. So thank you for that. May you continue for a long time in this way. Hopefully you'll come back to our Rotary Club again and give us another talk, please. Thank you for staying up so late, long time after bedtime. And Hirera, Kia ora, thank you. Members of the Rotary Club, will you give your appreciation in the usual way, please? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Past President Anthony. I note you didn't mention one very important New Zealander sat behind you. I would now, it rests on me to present to the Professor his speaker certificate, digitally, unsatisfactory in many ways. But I don't think this is the first one you've received, Professor, but hopefully you'll be receiving this one digitally in due course. Thank you so much for speaking to us today.
Thank you. My pleasure. And again, I'm sorry.
That leaves me now. No, not at all. We should have been we should have thought through that and made sure you were with us from the beginning. We did actually do a commemoration to Prince Philip at the beginning of our meeting, and I think you would have enjoyed being part of that. The next meeting, next Monday, is a business meeting, our annual general meeting, at which we will be making important decisions, and I do encourage all members to attend. We will also be, instead of electing Prince Philip as an honorary member for another year, we will be reflecting on what he has done for the club and what we have done together over the last 70 years. And I'm looking for contributions from members for that eulogy. So the meeting after that, I will take the opportunity of announcing, is by Fiona Chiniaska, who is the joint managing director of a research company called Source Global. And her expertise is in assessing, researching consultants and consultancy activity. Now, this is quite interesting because if you look where consultants are working, you get a fairly good idea of what governments are looking to do. And so I'll be talking more about what Fiona will be telling us next week, but that is the meeting for the week after, on the 19th of April. Now, the final toast of the meeting, of our lunch, is, if you will join me, to Rotary and peace the world over. And that is both to Rotary and to peace and the world over.
Rotary and peace the world over.
Rotary and peace the world over.